Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about future-proofing, building for sustainability and efficiency. And I'm talking to Dr. Tony Matthews today. He's a senior lecturer in urban and environmental planning at Griffith University. Hi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you for coming all the way to our studio today.
Very happy to do that.
Yeah. So first of all, do you mind introducing yourself in a bit more detail?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Dr. Tony Matthews. I'm a senior lecturer in urban and environmental planning at Griffith University. But I suppose more than that, I'm an urban and environmental planner generally. I'm professionally qualified as well as having my academic letters, but I work primarily in the university sector, largely on the research and strategic side of urban planning. So a lot of what I do is looks ahead to emerging problems or large issues that are coming down the track, maybe not tomorrow, but next week or next year or 50 years from now, as the case may be. So I'm invariably looking towards the future in the work that I do. And I work a lot with, well, obviously with other researchers and groups like the CSIRO, but also as well with government and the private sector and international governments as well, other countries. So it's quite an exciting field. There's a lot of opportunity and change and interesting things you can pursue.
That's so cool. And it's so cool that you get to see what's coming in the future. Do you think that, or has it happened yet that you have done some work and, you've now been able to look back and say, oh, I predicted this?
Yes. Actually, funny you mentioned that. The notion of community relocation, which we hear a lot about now, particularly when people are talking about floods. So there's been a lot of floods, for example, in Lismore in northern New South Wales, as one example, and so many, in fact, in the last few years, and so catastrophic that legitimate questions are now being asked about the viability of the future of that settlement. Maybe all of those houses and buildings should be moved somewhere, intentionally relocated. This was something that I was looking at 10 years ago, and I was trying to put together a framework for planning systems to undertake this kind of work. And what I did is I looked at any documented international cases of similar, whether it was moving a community away from a specific short-term impact or whether it was a kind of an ongoing environmental problem, like a town being built over a mine, for example, and starting to, it's not quite the same as a flood, but either way. So I looked at all the documented cases in the scientific literature, and from that then tried to derive a set of principles and practices to actually relocate a town if you were to do it through a planning system. It took me years to get that work published because nobody would touch it in my world. And now this is only 2014, 2015, but it was considered way beyond the horizon, almost to a disagreeable degree, because it was kind of like, if we start talking about this stuff now, then it's very hard to justify the ongoing conversations about things like, the Paris Accord, for example. So it took quite a number of years to get a sympathetic journal. And eventually I went outside my field. I went to a journal called Climatic Change, which is a very important journal internationally in the climate change field rather than the urban planning field. And they took it and published it straight away. And it blew up big time because that was 4 years after I wrote it, and but it landed in 2018 when people were ready for it. And now it's totally normal conversation. It's something that's almost planned for as commonly as housing or transport in some ways, in Australia at least anyway now. But a couple of years ago, nobody wanted to know about this. Nobody. So yeah, that's one where I was in ahead of the crowd and I wasn't rewarded for it in a sense,
Well, hopefully, now we can talk about some things, and that, I'm guessing that some of these things won't be good things, but we need to know about them, and we can start to maybe make changes a little bit quicker than 4 years.
100%. Yeah. What happened there was events overtook everything, right? So, however people felt about this idea, there were so many natural disasters over a couple of years that it was hard to ignore the idea. But you're absolutely right in your general point. I mean, I have a very good friend and colleague who did her PhD thesis many years ago on the idea that because we're not comfortable talking about human waste and sewage and things like that, because we find it hard to talk about the subject matter. The conversations that need to happen that inform good policy making don't happen as well as they should, because people don't want to talk about what sort of goes down the toilet and where it goes, And so she was looking at this problem with recreational boaters, where they were discharging effluent overboard and things like that, and didn't, they wanted to continue to be allowed to do that, and the maritime authorities were trying to bring in policies to stop this, and so everybody was trying to argue about this issue that nobody really wanted to talk about in the first instance, and nobody had good language. So she did a whole exploration of how do you make policy for things that you're too embarrassed to discuss. So language matters a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So we need to use very, I guess, concrete language.
We need to at least be clear that we're all talking about the same thing.
Okay, yeah.
And particularly in my world, you see a lot of this. And one of the criticisms that's often made of academics is that they're far too joyless in their language, and their conceptualizations of everything are so exaggerated. And anytime you read academic text, it's impenetrable. It's just concept followed by long word to bridge the sentence. This kind of. The reality is, it has to be like that, because we have to have an explicit understanding down to the micro level of what we're talking about, because otherwise we could be having different conversations but think we're having the same conversation. And so this is something that I'll often go through, particularly PhD work for. It's like, underline this. If you're going to use this concept, you need to be absolutely explicitly clear about how you understand it for the purposes of this work. And so, the sort of casual conversation that people have in everyday life doesn't require this, but in my world it does. So it makes you a little hyper-vigilant in some respects, probably more than you need to be.
Okay, yeah. So that's very interesting, about language as well, that we have to be so careful what we say, because we want to be having the right conversation in the right way and not, talking about two different things.
Well, that's it precisely. Yeah. And also people tend to have concerns that they'll say the wrong thing, or that they'll, it'll come out the wrong way and upset somebody or offend somebody or something like that. But that's sort of just part of it. I mean, in order to formulate your thoughts into language, you have to formulate, and so you won't necessarily arrive on the exact best way to say it the first time or whatever, but that doesn't mean you should be fearful of having the thoughts and trying to articulate them, So there's some people can be very fearful of not what they're trying to say, but saying it in the wrong way, but it's like the reality is what you're trying to say is reasonable.
Yeah.
So stick to that, and don't worry if you get the language wrong on the first go. You can fix that up. Your intent is not to upset people.
Yeah. I guess as long as you are clear about the fact that you maybe get things wrong, and that you're happy to think about what you've said and come back and say it again in a better way, that you're clear about that, and you don't sort of stick to your guns and say, no, what I said is what I said.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a general rule for all of us to be willing to adjust course, and that requires a certain amount of maturity in terms of being willing to admit that you've made an error, and accept that and move on from that. I mean, which is hard for people, and the kind of reaction that we tend to have to an error being pointed out is almost the same, whether it's like a tiny thing or a giant thing. So I think a lot of us, when somebody says that's incorrect, or you were wrong about that, or that was a bad call, even if it's a totally meaningless thing, we feel like, we've said it in public in front of the whole world online in real time or something,
And I guess that is maybe, do you think this partly could be because we are so online now that things can be recorded and filmed and then used later on, even if you've retracted it later?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And the other thing is that a lot of things are misinterpreted, or, there's like videos that be snipped and things like that. Yeah. So it's very easy to take a piece of benign content or something that somebody says and edit it in such a way that it looks like they've said the exact opposite, or that they're trying to incite something, or whatever the case may be. And the other thing is that, I mean, that's only when you're consciously on camera, like you and I are right now. But I mean, you spend so much of your time unconsciously on camera. I'll give you a good example. I was sitting in the airport this morning in the food area, you know what, and what I didn't notice was behind my table was a series of trash receptacles, you know, recycling waste and the usual, but it had a little screen. And so when you walk up to the bin, if you put the stuff in the right thing, it kind of gives you a big smiley face, and if you don't, it kind of makes a sad face and it's got a camera that's watching everybody all the time, and so it's motion activated. But what I didn't realize was that I had sat in the view of this camera for the last half an hour. Now I'm sure it wasn't watching me, but not just that. So I was like, I was being surveilled by something that's not anything to do with the security of the airport, let's say. But also, I was looking at stuff on my phone. I don't know if somebody could have gone into that tape and got, you know, not that I was looking at anything problematic, but the reality is I was looking at confidential work stuff, and, you know, you just don't know. Like, so all the time now we're in this potential trap. And it's uncomfortable, and especially if you start thinking about it, then you'll never open your mouth, you know.
Exactly. You know, except maybe you're in your home that, you know, you've got completely soundproofed, and then you can say whatever you want. But otherwise,
except your smart TV is listening.
Oh yeah, I know. Our phones now are probably the worst ones.
Oh, they're the absolute worst. They have all the dirt on you. Every bad thing you've ever said and typed, or, you know, it's all on there.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting conversation. Preface to the rest of our interesting conversation. But before we do move on to that, we're going to do a section called Have You Met Tony? Where we talk about some of your favorite things. Okay. First thing I'd like to know is, what is your favorite book?
I'm a big fan of a book series. Okay, first of all, what I read in my personal time is very different from what, you know, I read 10,000 words on public space this morning flying down here, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, so that's sort of, for most people, that's a week's worth of reading. But so what I read in my spare time is not what I read the rest of the time, and I read a lot the rest of the time. So I'm very fond of a book series, which is a continuing series following a character called Ross O'Carroll Kelly, it's an Irish book series. Mm-hmm. And his age and this has been going since the late 90s, and each one is about a year of his life, and he's kind of this spoiled rugby guy that, you know, never really made it in rugby beyond school, but is still trading on old glories and just kind of careens about the place, getting in trouble and living off his wealthy parents. And it sounds kind of inane, and is, but it's also very funny and endearing, and it really captures a lot of the cultural zeitgeist year to year. So it's become this very important social record of Ireland over 20 years for a lot of people, but they're great books. So I really enjoy reading them. And I'm pretty much more or less up to the current one, I think.
Do they release like one a year?
About one a year, yeah.
That's actually fascinating, because then you can go back and see what was, you know, happening in like the 90s, but not just what was happening, but what we thought.
Yeah, because if you go back and read the 90s ones, it's like all of the girls are super excited because Starbucks has come to Dublin for the first time, you know, this kind of thing, and they're all chattering about it, and all the fashion that was, you know, or for the guys and the girls, they were all wearing Ralph Lauren back there. They don't wear that back then. They don't wear it now, you know, and you know, it's all, so yeah, you get to track this stuff, you know.
And it'd be also great, I think, to grow up with it, you know, as you age, particularly if you're all the same age as him, or roughly the same age, to go through maybe some of the same life experiences as him. So, you know, then you can look back and sort of think about where you were at that age.
That's it, exactly. And so for me personally, it's very, there's a real resonance there, because he is exactly the same age as me.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And what about a movie you've enjoyed?
Okay. You know, I was grinning like a fool at Top Gun Maverick recently. Like I really was. You know, it was just like straight to the point. You know, there was no messing around. Nobody was trying to tell me what politics I should or shouldn't believe in. There was none of that, you know, which was wonderful, but it was straight up. I enjoyed that a lot. I saw Oppenheimer in the cinema with my parents recently. I was in Ireland for a visit, and I went to see it with them, which I also enjoyed a lot. It didn't need to be 3 hours. I don't think it did. Funny enough, Cillian Murphy, who plays Oppenheimer, went to school with me. And is from our city, which is a very small city, like, and so now that he's nominated for a bunch of awards, everybody back home is sort of, you know, sharpening up their how I know Cillian stories.
When you're in the cinema, was it like the cinema that you were in watching? Was it the one that he would have gone to?
Maybe.
So do you think there was maybe more of a reaction in the cinema because maybe people
By the time
knew
I
him?
saw it, it was September, and it was only me and a couple of retirees in the afternoon, maybe at the start. But I do remember actually seeing one of his first big movies, which was a movie called 28 Days Later, back in the early 2000s. And that was a packed cinema. And when he came on screen and everybody sort of knew him, there was a big cheer, you know. And but yeah, by the time Oppenheimer came around, he was pretty well established. But I suspect that if his parents went to see it, they probably went to that cinema, because his parents, my parents, all lived close by. That would be the local cinema, you know.
That'd be very cool to go see the movie with his parents, maybe.
Yeah. He's got a house as well, a holiday house near where we have a holiday house, and he'd been down there just before, you know. But that's the thing about him; he's often spotted. You know, he's not living in the Hollywood Hills behind security most of the time. So he's a kind of a regular guy for people, which is nice, and we all wish him well. But I did enjoy the movie, and I'm not just saying that because it was one of our own. It was very good. It probably was too long, as I say, most things are nowadays. But yeah, and just as the last one, I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once and didn't like it.
Oh,
And
why?
I really wanted to. It just didn't do it for me. I just was like, no, this is just there's too much going on. It's too clever for its own. I really wanted to like it, and I'd heard the positive things about it, and I approached it in a good spirit, but it just didn't do it for me.
I think, watching it was quite complex and it benefited. I watched it at home. So if I got too confused, I could stop and like read about it. You know, sometimes you need to like review and, you know, read what the themes are to actually understand what's happening. So I think that was really good.
That might have helped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're watching it in the movie cinema, maybe it's just everything is happening all at once.
Well, it was, and that's kind of how I felt, and it just seemed a bit sort of like it was a cacophony, and things kept changing, and she was jumping around from here to there, and I was just like, oh, I'm kind of spinning out here. I'm losing the plot, literally.
Yeah, but I did think the visuals were really amazing.
The visuals were great. It looked
Yeah,
great. It looked
yeah.
great. I just couldn't quite, the pacing and the editing and things, just it didn't all come together the way I wanted it to.
Okay.
But that was just me. Everybody else liked it.
Yeah, I think maybe everyone has different opinions on movies, and you know, things appeal to different people for different reasons.
100%. Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I liked the cast. I mean, I thought Michelle Yeoh was great, and I thought her daughter was great, and the guy that played her husband was very good. You know, they all did a sterling job, especially her.
Yeah.
She was great. Michelle Yeoh, I mean, she had about 40 different roles in that movie, but it just didn't pull together for me.
Yeah, fair enough. What about podcasts that you're listening to?
Yeah, I listen to lots of things. It depends on what I'm sort of following at the time, and I don't necessarily mean titles so much as topic. I tend to follow information rather than, like, I have a few podcasts that I'm loyal to, or I'll find a podcast series like this one where I'll go and I'll watch a bunch of them, having found one.
Yeah.
And there's a few I will go back to sort of over time, like Disgraceland, which is a music podcast. I really enjoy that. I've been listening to that for 6 or 7 years, probably, like right since they started, and they're huge now.
I haven't heard of that one. What's it about?
So Disgraceland is basically kind of like it's more like a radio production. It's not an interview. It's more like a kind of a magazine thing. But each episode is about some musician and their disgraceful behavior, hence Disgraceland. So, you know, he's done like 50 or 60, maybe more people by now, but it's like the kind of sordid and crazy stories of not just rock and roll people, but like musicians from the 20th century generally. Like, so even people like Little Richard were worse than most of the rock and roll bands, for example, but people don't realize that, you know. So he's done all of that, it's not necessarily every band's full career. You know, there was like, he's done an episode just on the kind of controversy with the Rolling Stones in Canada in the 1970s and Justin Trudeau's mother and all this kind of stuff. You know, that was a big story at the time. And, you know, so it's very entertaining. It's a good one. I like that a lot just for kind of casual listening. Another one that I listen to occasionally is Mark Maron's WTF podcast. For some reason, I have a particular interest in listening to actors talk about their craft. Not that I have any real interest in being an actor, but the more serious ones have really studied humanity and human engagement and psychology and the process that their learning process. And he kind of tends to really get into that with people. I find that very interesting because I'm always interested in how other people sort of harness the creative mind. I feel like I know how I do it, but I'm not them. So that's very interesting. And then again, you know, depending on topics, what I'm interested in, I'll follow topics rather than anything. So I, for example, I listen to a lot of podcast content on things like health and fitness. I'm not one of these life hackers, but I like to have a good foundation, and that changes as you change and as you age and as you're, so I kind of try and get a lot of information on things like that. So I've probably I won't go on about this, but I would say that podcasts are probably the thing that I have enjoyed the most from the internet media content, and probably the things I've benefited the most from. I seem to have a very good capacity to absorb knowledge when I listen to it rather than when I read it, and they've been very powerful for that, and they're just such a great resource.
Not to blow my own horn, but I mean, the reason I came into podcasting was because I love the podcasting format so much. I did journalism in class and I learned about podcasts. I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. Because I think that the audio format is such a great way to learn, because I can't sit still and read. I need to do something with my hands. So listening is so good for that.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with you, Gabriella. And I've sort of moved a lot of my learning content for my students that way as well. I'm more inclined now to give them something to listen to than something to read, and they'll tend to do it. Whereas if you say, "Hey, read this article," it'll really, open up your perspectives. They won't do it. But.
Yeah, that's really cool as well that you're, I guess, giving different modes of or different ways of learning to your students, because that means that people who do learn better with audio, people who learn better with reading, can have a bit of both, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other thing is, people are really time poor, including students. It's like the days of most students being full time and not having outside jobs or anything like that are almost gone. So most students, particularly at undergraduate, do have busy lives, and a lot of them do have jobs, and and so forth, and so they don't have the time that students once had. At least when I went through undergrad, most people seem to dedicate their full time to study during the university year and then work the summers. That's not the case anymore. So we did have time to read. If we didn't do it, it was because we were being slack, but it wasn't because we ran out of time. Whereas now I kind of feel like students don't. So I sort of say things to them like, look, I need you to listen to this. Mm-hmm. You can just as easily listen to it in the car on the way home. You don't have to make an hour where that's the thing you do. It can be passive listening, but you need to take it on. And I think you were talking about passive listening, and that's really what I do as well. And it's great.
Yeah, it's great. So thank you, podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you have a role model?
Not really. I have people that I take influence from, or people that I take direction from, or people that I take advice from, but I don't have a single role model. No.
I do think it's good to get, advice, inspiration from a wide range of people. Not everyone's going to provide everything that you need.
They're not. And there's a certain craft as well in being willing to take advice, because a lot of the time, in order to be willing to take advice, you have to be willing to ask for advice. If you're going to ask for advice, I really think it's important to be prepared for that advice to not meet your bias, because a lot of us would be hoping for a certain answer, or to be pointed in a certain direction, or told you're doing great, just keep doing what you're doing, and the advice might be quite opposite to that, and it might be exactly what you need to hear for the long term. But many of us will resist that, and therefore we will resist seeking advice. I've gone the opposite way. I turn into the wind now. I'm like, all right, there it is, it's all out. I don't be as brutal as you want. But that's the nature of my industry. People are telling you that they're trying to tear down your ideas all the time, so you get a thick skin for it. But advice is only as good as your willingness to take it on.
That's true. I have noticed that I sometimes hold back from asking for advice because I'm a bit scared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you don't want somebody to say, you know what, you could be doing better at this.
Yeah.
Even if you think you probably know inside you could. And I'm not. Obviously don't know you, so I can't think of it, but you might already have that internal feeling. You just don't want somebody else to say it, because then it's real.
Yeah, exactly. And have you done any courses that have inspired you?
I did. I changed my entire direction by doing a master's in planning and sustainable development for 2 years. I wouldn't say it inspired me so much as completely reorientated me. I was very inspired at the idea of doing it. The course itself was not as inspiring as my kind of vision for the material, but in that regard, the course was just a pathway, an on-ramp, really. Mm-hmm. So it was very good for me. I wouldn't say it inspired me, but I was inspired to do a master's in planning, and I left work to restart in my mid-20s to do this. I was inspired to to do that because I thought this is something that has a future and an application and that matters. And this is a way into understanding that world. And I'm very inspired by understanding that world. So in that regard, that's probably as close as it's come. Yeah.
I think that still counts. You were inspired to do the course and, everything and you're still inspired to use what you've learned from that course.
Look, that's at the foundation of everything I've done since. And I'll never deny that. And I even went back into the seminar for them last year when I was in Ireland, 15 or so years since I'd actually been a student there, just because I wouldn't have been able to do a seminar if I hadn't been a student there previously.
Yeah, amazing. So we're going to move on to our interview now.
Sure.
So before I start, I do like to maybe set a few definitions so that, me and our listeners know exactly what we're starting from.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I'd like to know is, how do you define household management?
Household management is managing your household, which includes managing your house and managing your life and all of the component parts. So if you don't own a house, that doesn't mean that you don't do household management, because household management is as much personal management as space management.
That's true. We've always called it household management, but I don't live in a house. I live in an apartment.
Exactly.
But I still have, I guess maybe it's home management.
Yeah. I think that would probably be fine. But, again, as you speak about home management, it's not just managing the apartment, it's managing your life within that apartment and managing the apartment in a way that allows you to have a life successfully within those walls.
Yes.
And keeping that going, and that just tends to scale up from there. Then you get a house which comes with a garden, and then it just gets more and more.
Yes. I think we always want more.
Yeah, I mean, most of us seem to, at least in this country anyway, most people still want a house on land in the suburbs. It's slowly getting to be a smaller proportion, but it's like falling at about 0.5% a year. So it's not going to change anytime soon.
Yeah. So that sort of brings us to maybe the first topic that we want to talk about. So when we're looking at housing, what are we currently looking at, and what is the future? Is it realistic?
I mean, there's a lot to that question. There's a few things to say. First of all, what's the future? The future is we're going to have continued supply problems in Australia and continued price spikes if something significant is not done to either rapidly scale up housing delivery, which has its natural limits, or something isn't done to try and more capably manage migration targets, because they're too high at the moment. Because we're on this rebound from having 2 years in COVID where we didn't. So, and if you recall, what happened during that was all the rents fell in the capital cities because there was vacancies, and now we have the exact opposite effect. And there was nothing built in that period, so we've introduced a lot more people into the same volume of stock. So those two, the sort of supply and demand issue in Australia is not going to resolve until we get a bit more clever about, and I don't know how to achieve this. It's something I think about a lot, and government has tried this and hasn't had much luck. But it's one thing to have a migration system. Like, Australia is very fortunate to have a skilled migration system. So most people that come here are immediately contributing clear value. The difficulty is most of them come to either Melbourne or Sydney. And those two cities are bursting at the seams completely. And so what then happens is people are displaced out of those cities and they move to Southeast Queensland. So Melbourne and Sydney get the bulk of the international migration. Southeast Queensland, Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sunshine Coast get the bulk of the internal migration. A lot of that's placed from down south. And so you have this peculiar system in Australia where the immigration system is managed at the federal level, urban development is managed at the state level, and the targets that are set for immigration at the federal level are national targets, not state-based targets, and there's no capacity or architecture within the system to direct people to certain areas. They've tried to send, to incentivize moving regional and things like that. But once you get a visa to come to Australia, nobody's going to say, look, sorry, Sydney's out for the first couple of years. So this problem is continuing. And so you have cities that are scrambling to try and house people and build enough infrastructure to try and cope with this population increase, that they're not, first of all, they're not necessarily the ones that are making the decision about having this much of a population increase, and they also have no certainty about the figures, as in how many are actually going to come versus how many are predicted, or whatever the case may be. So that's going to be a huge problem. in terms of housing and household management in Australia. That's a big one. And, that it has associated problems with depleting budgets, insecure rental, situations. People will defer having kids if they don't own their house. So it has all sorts of associated flow-on problems. The other thing is a lot of the housing that we have built over the last 10 to 15 years has been either unfit for what people actually want or just generally unfit for purpose because it's so poorly built. And those are two massive problems as well. So there's been, one of the big things that's happening in all the major Australian cities is this thing called urban consolidation, which is more density without increasing land area. So you can either build up or you can do townhouses or, those kinds of gated communities clustered together, all that sort of stuff, right? But people don't want that. That's not the stock that the majority of buyers and renters actually want. It's the stock that the planning system and the housing system and developers have decided we will have, but it's not necessarily what people want. And there's plenty of information out there about that. There's lots of research on what people's housing preferences are, and they're not 2-bedroom high rises in central Melbourne for the rest of their lives. That's fine for a certain period, or some people maybe for their whole lives, but most people, they want other things over the course of their life. And so we're not really building what people want, which is why the things that they do want, like detached houses in the middle ring suburbs, are so expensive because everybody wants them. And the other thing is, the last thing is that a lot of the stock that we've built has not been good. And that is the high rise as well as the low rise. So, I mean, you're probably quite familiar with things like flammable cladding, but there's also been, I don't know how many luxury apartment buildings in Australia over the last couple of years have had structural problems. Sydney particularly is probably having the worst of that. Just very, very poor build qualities out there. Not every developer does that, but many have. And similar with small outhousing out in the urban fringes, thrown up in a hurry, cheap materials, poor finishes, no insulation, urban heat island effects. So you get a house, but is it a home? Is it a comfortable place to live? Those are different questions. Will it last? Will it stand the test of time? That's, probably not. So why are we building houses that are going to fall over in 40 or 50 years?
Yeah. I have a friend who's looking to buy a house, and he says he won't buy anything that's younger than his son because his son is 10 years old.
He's absolutely right. In fact, he'd probably be better off not to buy anything that was... In fact, he should... Well, you could go old... I wouldn't... Yeah. He's probably right. I mean, the building regs changed in the 1980s and things got a lot better for a while. So if you can get a house that's kind of from the 80s or 90s, the likelihood is it'll be way more solidly built. But if it's post-2000, it's probably not going to be well built.
Okay. Wow. That's not a huge time to, in terms of housing stock. I think that if you want something built between the 80s and the 2000s, that's not a huge time range.
It's not. No, it's not. It really isn't. So, I mean, up to the 80s, there was the building regs were quite weak. And so a lot of housing in Australia was filled with asbestos and things like that. And, people would just start out with a cottage and then they build a bedroom every time a baby was born, in the sort of post-war era. So a lot of that suburban stock sort of hand-built. There's a lot of DIY stuff out there. That wasn't great quality. What's tended to happen is a lot of that now since 2000 has been demolished and the sites have been rebuilt on. But most suburban development since the 2000s has been built to a cheaper quality generally. But in the early 80s, they changed the building regulations. Things like asbestos could no longer be used. And so for about 20 years there was some very solid housing being built because that was the time of the economics of the housing market were very different in the 80s and 90s because they weren't as... First of all, the Australian housing market wasn't open to global capitalism, wasn't open to global capital the way that it is now. So you couldn't speculate on property here if you didn't live here. And secondly, the migration system was running at a much gentler pace. So the pressure of population was much less and therefore houses lasted longer and were built for longer. And, so it was very different. But yeah, that's the kind of, as far as I can discern in most Australian cities, that's a house from that period is usually fairly reliable. That's not to say that there aren't others. You could pick up a California cottage or a California bungalow here in Melbourne that was built in the 1920s that'll still be good for another 100 years. But yeah, you just have to know what you're doing. Buyer beware, especially in this country.
Yeah. So I want to move back to what you were saying before about people, the houses that people want to buy and the houses that are being developed, because it does seem like what you're saying with our migration or immigration, we need more high density housing because, we have limited space and we've got all these people coming in who want to live in these big cities like Melbourne and Sydney. It seems like high rises is the way to go if you're wanting to house a lot of people. And I know I've spoken to experts before who've said that if you want to be more ecologically friendly, high rises are the way to go. But if people don't want to live in these areas, what's the solution, I guess? How do we, do we need to change society's attitudes towards these new types of housing, or do we need to build housing that, I guess, accommodates what people want while still being denser, if that makes sense?
Probably that is what we want. So, okay, first of all, I mean, let's just pull this apart a little bit, right? The notion that high rise is more sustainable is not accurate.
Okay.
At least as a universal truth. Mm-hmm. And in fact, this has been analyzed extensively where, life cycle patterns of people living in high-rise buildings in the CBDs have been tested against life cycle patterns and movement patterns of people out in the suburbs and, try to account for what's their carbon production and things like that. What's often forgotten about high-rise buildings is they have lights on 24 hours a day. They require a huge amount of machinery and infrastructure to keep them going that's on 24 hours a day. They're pumping water 24 hours a day, and they're running lifts 24 hours a day. So those things are enormous, and air conditioning 24 hours a day. Those things are enormous consumers of electricity. And so the idea is, you divide the total volume of activity here by the number of units or people or whatever, and it comes down and it works out as more respectable than somebody living in the suburbs. That's not always the case, not at all. So sometimes the energy profiles and things of high density living can be much higher. People just don't realize that. So it's not a universal.
Okay.
It is often the case and often not the case, but It's certainly not a universal. The thing I would say that is fundamentally missing from all of this is there are different ways of achieving the same density from the same land area using a tool called block ratio. So say you have a site that's, I don't know, let's say 50 square meters by 50 square meters. You can, and say, let's just call it a square site. It's 50 by 50. So you can build a square building 48 by 48, taking up the whole site, and there'll be a meter all around it just to keep it legal. And then you can go up pretty high on it and sort of, so you can achieve a lot of gross floor area by doing that. But there's different arrangements out there as well. If you look at North American cities and European cities, they have much higher densities than Australian cities, and they're not necessarily high rise. So, for example, if you look at a city like London, most things are only 4 and 5 stories, but they're just consistent. There's streets and streets and streets of them. You'll see more of this in Sydney probably than Melbourne, but or you look at a city like Barcelona, which is all an awful lot of it is houses in terraces built around internal courtyards. Mm-hmm. So, the block ratio thing is like if you have 50 by 50 and you want to get 10,000 square meters out of that, what configurations can you put on this site? And there's usually a few. What we have tended to lose sight of in this country, I feel, is a vision of the alternatives beyond high rise. Okay. And so the solution, at least within 5 kilometers of any central business district in an Australian city, is always just build up. They don't even consider looking at other models. They don't look at 3-step walk-ups like you have in the US, for example, or, terraced streets like you'd get in parts of Europe, or internalized courtyards, or 4-story buildings, or, 6-story buildings, or with setbacks. There's all sorts of ways of doing it. But I would say what's most lacking here is appreciation of achieving density with elegance and with good design, as opposed to just ticking the box and saying, yes, we delivered the required floor area and built another tall building that nobody is going to remember.
Yeah, I think I was speaking to someone the other week and they were saying that in Australia, it feels like you've got, these 1-story or 2-story houses, and then you've got these huge blocks of buildings, and there's nothing really in between.
That's my point exactly. You go from 2 to 20. And, the other thing is, culturally, there's a lot to account for here as well, because, for example, there would be a fair few families in Australia that would appreciate the opportunity to do intergenerational living. In some countries and some cultures, that's very normal. And so that requires a different kind of space configuration. If you want to have 2 generations of adults and 1 generation of children all under one roof, obviously you're going to need different space, and so the average suburban house doesn't offer that in any sense, and neither does the average apartment. And so we have these needs as well, which are often not met. So yeah, there's a lot to consider. I mean, you can get really fine grained into the kind of, as I say, the cultural stuff, but basically, most people seem to want eventually at least to have the option of a house on land in the suburbs, even if they don't exercise that option. That is still the prevalent desire here.
Yeah.
And that's one of the major pressure points in the market, is people trying to get in for the first time to the suburbs.
Yep. So I guess maybe it's a twofold solution, which is building a variety of different types of housing. So accommodating things like that middle size buildings.
Yeah.
With different maybe cultural layouts. And then also maybe changing our desires a little bit. So we're not wanting the Australian block of house with a block of land situation, and maybe having slightly more dense living, but not quite high rises necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, so they what do they call this? We're activating the hidden middle, they call it in Brisbane. Or at least they were for a while. Activating the hidden middle, I think, was what they were calling it. So the idea was that there's still a fair bit of space out there in the suburbs, and that can be exploited. Like, for example, if you wanted a generational living, you may not want to knock down your house and rebuild it, but you might instead prefer to put some kind of a chalet or a prefabricated or a modular unit in the backyard that's an independent living unit. And maybe the grandparents go out there and they might be happier out there to have their own privacy, but still be close by. That sort of thing is like quite difficult to do. Like, a lot of planning restriction, or a lot of planning systems will have restrictions that will make it quite difficult to achieve these kinds of things, So the idea with activating the kind of hidden middle is say we do identify these small patches of land, how can we then create a system that allows people to take advantage of those opportunities instead of sending them down some bureaucratic rabbit hole that they'll never get back out of, So Sydney has been doing probably better than most at that. But yeah, there are limits to that as well. But yes, all of this sort of stuff is important. The idea that we can just keep building high rises in town and building, townhouses in the middle ring suburbs and small lot housing on the outer suburbs, that's not doing it. It hasn't. We've been doing that for 10 years now, and it's not working.
Okay. So that's not very future-proof,
No, definitely not. No. And, if you want to talk future-proof, the other thing is that, like, a lot of those houses, you'll be drained financially trying to keep them cool, for example, in the summertime, because they're so poorly built and so poorly insulated. Or down in a place like Melbourne, you'll be drained in the wintertime trying to keep them warm. So yeah, it's not just, it's the operational impact as well on the resident is a big problem.
Okay, so if you are looking to renovate your house or your home apartment that you've already owned, or even if you're looking to build, what are some things that you should be looking at to future-proof your own home?
The absolute simplest thing that you can do to future-proof your home is insulate it properly, which is like a principle that's completely absent, I feel, in this country. But because the notion is like, it doesn't get cold enough here to need insulation, but actually insulation keeps the warmth out as well when and most houses here are not insulated at all. I mean, I've spent 20 years looking at like renewable energy, deep energy retrofits, all this kind of stuff. And the thing that always rises to the top is that the absolute best thing that you can do is insulate properly. So it's energy efficiency.
Yeah.
Everybody kind of wants to sort of go and spend 50 grand on a fancy solar system or something, or that will have some benefit. Don't make no mistake, but like dollar for dollar, nothing's going to do better than insulating your house.
Yeah.
And that's the simplest thing that you can do.
It seems so simple just to put insulation in.
Yeah.
Why don't I don't know why we don't do it.
It's not in the imagination, because as far as I can work out, for example, here in Melbourne, people go, it's only cold like that 2 months of the year, and up in Queensland, where I'm from, they kind of go, well, look, it's hot most of the time. So, like, we're just kind of used to it. Why bother insulating against it? What difference does it make? It's like we're used to, it's like this kind of, just because we've been doing it this way, we shouldn't do it any differently. It's there's no good reason not to do it, but this folk wisdom just floats around.
Yeah, as someone who has had a very cold apartment that also got extremely hot in summer, I would have loved some more insulation in my rental apartment.
Well, exactly. I mean, imagine if it had been 5 degrees hotter when it was the cold weather and 5 degrees cooler in the hot weather, and you would have been a lot happier probably.
Yep. Wouldn't have had to move into someone else's apartment on the hottest days.
Yeah. Or, spend however much you needed to spend to keep your air conditioning going because you had no other option for cooling the place, which most people don't.
Yeah, exactly. So that seems like a very simple method to future-proof our homes. Is there any other things that we can do?
Plant trees if you have land. Like I work a lot in climate change adaptation, particularly climate change adaptation on the district scale, the urban district scale. And trees have a huge benefit in terms of climate change adaptation because they provide shade, they reduce sunlight penetration, they provide biodiversity, they help with stormwater, they clean the air around the place, they add value to your property. Like that's very well confirmed. Yeah. So you could do a lot to reduce heat in your house. For example, say you have a western facing wall and it's catching sun all day in the all afternoon. By planting a tree there, you can potentially, or even some hedging, you could potentially deal with that problem without using a technological fix. And you'll also get these co-benefits because you'll now have provided a place for birds to nest and insects and a variety of other things. Plus, greenery makes us happy. So that would be another thing. If you have space, plant a tree strategically, ideally, but just, even if you just plant one anyway, even if it's a fruit tree, because it'll give you something to focus on, get you back in touch with nature. But then, of course, beyond that, it's things like, primarily in Australia, it's solar systems are the main household sustainability thing.
Yeah. Okay.
They work great, but the problem is the price of electricity in this country is so high that even with the solar system, you're still getting these horrible bills. So the payback period is longer than it ought to be, and obviously you can't do it if you don't own your property, and you still need to have the 6 or 8 or 10,000 up front to pay for the thing, and so you're kind of paying yourself back over time. You lose all of that if you sell the place. So those are all real considerations, but that doesn't seem to have stopped most people. There's a huge amount of solar on rooftops out there now that's doing hot water systems, electricity, heating pools. Any and all of those are good options if you can afford them and you have the space for them. That plus insulation will, significantly transform not just the comfort of your house, but also the profile of your bills.
Yeah. I have a question about the greenery side.
Yeah.
So even if you don't, if you're not able to buy a house or a home where you do have the land to plant trees, is it worth maybe investing a little bit more in an area that has more greenery around you, like more parks or, trees planted along the streets?
When you say is it worth investing, do you mean like from a kind of a lifestyle perspective, like a livability perspective?
Yeah, livability.
Yeah. Yes. Like just at the most basic level, we're sort of fundamentally programmed to respond to nature and greenery, which is why you notice its absence when it's not there. So when it is there, it's always a good thing, and it will always have a bounce in terms of property values as well. So there is a kind of an economic argument on a very fundamental level that if you buy into a slightly greener neighborhood, even if you spend more at the start, you'll get it back at the end. But beyond that, I think one of the things, for example, that people really got a sense of during the COVID lockdowns was like what they did or didn't have in their neighborhoods. And it turns out that, most people would actually appreciate having a public park, even if it's not a big one, but just some place to go or take their kids or whatever. And again, it's the sort of thing that you notice the absence of when you don't have it. And so, if you're going to buy a house, is it good to have a park nearby? Yes, it'll add value to your property, but it'll also, give you access to that space. And even if you don't have anyone in your family that might use that space, you might eventually sell your house to somebody that will look at it that way. And also that green space will reduce overall heat load in the area because a certain amount of solar radiation will be soaked up by that rather than soaked up by the hard surfacing. So it's always a good idea to try and be proximate to greenery. The more, the better. As much as you can afford would be my advice. Buy into the neighborhood that has the most greenery relative to your whatever your purchasing budget is. That will benefit you greatly in many ways.
I very much, I've worked in many retail spaces, and I always appreciate the little parks that you can go and eat in because, you want that space that's not necessarily public. Like sitting on a road, eating your sandwich doesn't feel very good. You're just watching people walk past. But you don't want to be stuck in your office.
No.
So I really love those parks. I mean, it's a little bit different than what we were talking about, but I just think they bring so much value to any space that they're in, whether you live there or if you work there.
Yeah, they're called pocket parks, and cities are wise to how good they are. The biggest problem with them, honestly, is just finding space for them or finding the land for them. But they are enormously beneficial, and they have a huge amount of value for citizens and or for cities and their citizens. You know, it's like just as you described. I mean, even a small amount of green space will be hugely popular if it's there relative to if there's no green space there, then the people won't come.
So I'd also like to know about, if there are any like misconceptions or challenges when you are looking to build your home, more efficiently or more sustainably.
I think the number one thing to acknowledge is if you're building a home that didn't exist previously, that is in itself the definition of unsustainable. Right?
So even if you use like the most efficient manners, the most natural materials, the most locally sourced stone, it's still maybe.
Well, you're still turning something natural into something constructed, and it can never go back to being natural again. So in that sense, it's not sustainable.
Okay, so maybe instead of building, renovating is better.
Either way, look, it doesn't. I mean, that's only a kind of an abstract point, but the reality, I guess, I'm trying to get to is that like there's limits to sustainability, like on all levels. At the headline level, disturbing nature at all is not sustainable if you want to get into it, but when it comes to sort of like building a sustainable house, let's say, or building a sustainable building, there's a number of things to think about. Like, I mean, number one is probably design. Is it a sustainable design? And by sustainable design, what I mean is how does the building perform subject to heat, cold, wind, any other environmental condition that might affect the internal climate of the building or the climate in the envelope around the outside of the building. So we have all sorts of design techniques like passive design, for example, that can significantly reduce a building's energy demand or air conditioning demand or space heating or cooling demand because the building is built and designed in a way that reduces heat load building up or excess cold building up. Or so passive design is very important. We don't do nearly enough of it in this country. And also a building that's properly passively designed should be airtight as well. And so it should have a kind of an almost permanent internal temperature.
Okay.
Again, it's all, it's designed at the outset, and then you can do the engineering, the mathematics around it, and then you build it and you can test it on site to prove that it's working. The idea being that it should reduce significantly the operational costs of the building, as well as making it a more pleasant place for people to be. One of the reasons that doesn't happen more is because the people that build buildings, especially commercial buildings, are usually not the same people that occupy those buildings, and therefore the average commercial developer will say, look, commercial tenants want mid-range stuff. They're not looking for fancy high-end passive buildings. The returns are not there for them, so we're not going to deliver that to market because we can get tenants for what we are delivering to market. So when you do see those buildings, it's usually like some big company that has decided to do their headquarters that way, kind of a statement building, but it's not mainstream, and that's unfortunate. Another thing when it comes to the sustainability stuff is materials. Like concrete is incredibly polluting, steel is incredibly polluting, glass is incredibly polluting, timber is far less polluting, but there's very few high-rise timber buildings. There's only one in Brisbane, for example. I
didn't realize there was a timber high-rise building.
Yeah. I mean, there are timber high-rise buildings, yes. And most of them are precision cut off-site and sort of assembled almost like Lego on-site. A lot of them are modular, but yes, there are. It's a relatively new technique. There was no real sort of good reason to build high rise with timber, for most of the 20th century, because we had plenty of steel and concrete, and we weren't really concerned about the environmental footprint of those things. But that's one of the reasons timber is more and more getting used now in building, is it has a much lower environmental footprint. So materials matter. And when you look around, again, you look at an urban skyline, it's all concrete, glass, steel, all highly polluting materials, all with a huge amount of embodied energy in their production, almost certainly produced outside of the country and then shipped. So they're arriving with an enormous kind of carbon tag already. So the materials are a thing as well. And then just the other domain is the operation of the building. So it's things like do you have lights that are working on lights that are on sensors, so they'll go on and off as people enter and exit, but they won't be on all the time, just as one example. Or there was you see things like non-flush toilets and things like that, especially in the men's and stuff like that, where you're supposed to use chemicals to spray them down instead of water running through that's supposed to save on water and things like that. That will all be part of a kind of a building level water design plan or water management plan. So when people are trying to do sustainable design, they'll look at things like water and electricity and sewage and other utilities, and how do we get a more sustainable performance there? How do we have less water coming out of the taps and being wasted down the drains? And how do we maximize our electricity use by putting in LCD or LED lights instead of halogen, or whatever the case may be? So you can sort of look at it in those domains as well. And things like the Green Star rating and other rating tools will also look at this stuff. So there's a number of different ways. It's like from the full kind of concept design of the building to what you actually put in each room. You can, how you want to do your sustainability criteria.
So there's really, I guess there's quite a number of ways that you could really go all out and design a passive house and have everything really efficient. Or if you can't afford it, or if you're renovating and it's not quite in your budget to do everything yet, you can start by changing the light bulbs and maybe changing the tap so you use less water.
Yeah. And a lot of people will already have done that. Like if you go and try and buy tapware now, a lot of it is water sensitive and things like that. It'll have a particular flow rate or whatever. So people will kind of naturally do that. Those things all help. Like there's often a bit of a frustration point with some of this stuff as well. Some of that kind of those low flow technologies, it's such a low flow that it's practically useless flow. It's not good enough, but so there is a kind of there's a mid-level here. I guess just thinking while you mentioned the passive house thing, I suppose maybe one of the reasons that passive houses don't happen more in Australia is just because the climate is a bit too variable. Like what I mean to say is that the temperature fluctuations could potentially be too extreme. Although, I suppose you get very deep winters in Europe where you'll find a lot of these, but you won't get summers above maybe 21 or 22 degrees. So the temperature range is like -5 to 25, say it's a 30-degree range. Whereas, I think it's like whatever it is here today, 22 or 3, and it was like 37 at the weekend, I
know, we've had days where it goes from like 19 degrees to like 40 degrees and then back down to 19 degrees in one day.
And so if you've got a passive house and you're tracking along nicely at 19 degrees and then suddenly it spikes up to 30 or 35, the house will suck in a lot more heat that it can't then freely release again, So there are some issues around that, I suppose. But yeah, I don't really see a lot of I don't see a lot of passive houses in Australia. I've never seen a lot of them.
Yeah, I did speak to someone about this, and I don't think there are that many. So anyway, be interesting to see, do a bit more research on this.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is they often tend to be a bit of a grand designs type project. So the budget is beyond a lot of people.
Yeah, so it's not really within the range of, your average house owner.
Yeah, it's like you're effectively probably electing to add 40%. Let's just call it 40% just for simplicity. You're probably going to add 40% to the construction cost on the basis that the operational cost will be lower, and you'll realize that in time. But most people will not take that long-term view, or they won't be able to spend more than they have right now. So it's like, I'd like to do passive, I just can't afford to.
Yeah, unfortunately, you do have to live somewhere, and not everyone can afford to build the perfect house and live somewhere else while it's happening.
That's it exactly. Yeah. And this is the same reason why a lot of the stock that I was sort of pointing a finger at earlier exists. There's still a large market for it, and people will still sort of buy it with knowledge. Like, I know that by buying a house that has a mediocre build quality on the urban fringe and performs poorly in hot or cold weather, I know that I'm going to be far from everything. I know I'm going to be driving more. I know I'm going to have to rely on the air conditioner in the summer more than I would like to. But the fact that it's mine is still persuasive enough. And hopefully in 5 years, I'll have enough equity and my financial situation will be better so I can get out of here. So there's a giant market for this stuff. And so developers will defend it on that basis. But, again, we're asking people in many cases to take on a lot of externalities with their purchase.
So we're going to move on to the practices and habits section. So this is a chance for you to talk about something you've learned from your research or from your work that you have implemented in your own home. So I'd like to know, what is a practice you do in your own home to manage home maintenance?
Vigilance. I just keep an eye on things actively. I'm out around the house and garden a couple of times a week. I'll notice if there's something out of shape or something's broken or something looks like it might break. And therefore, I'm in a better position to do something about it. So for me, I don't like unexpected surprises, especially expensive ones. So it's much better to be vigilant and keep an eye on things. And if I see, that looks like it might become a problem. It's the same thing as your car. Like you don't necessarily wait for the light to come on the dashboard to go for a service. It's like you keep an eye. If it starts to sound funny, you take it to the mechanic. It's the same thing. So vigilance and just keeping an eye on things and not letting things go too long. Once you start to see a problem, act on it, because it can run away, especially with houses and structures and things. And also things like, there's all sorts of other problems that you get in houses like mold and things like that, where it can, like within a few days, overwhelm your capacity to respond to it. You might have to move out and get the professionals in if you're not quick enough, this kind of thing. So just have your eyes open. I mean, if you've invested so much of your fortune and life in a particular building, and you're trying to make that the staging point of your entire existence, then same as you keep an eye on your health, keep an eye on the health of your house.
What kinds of things are you looking for? Because I think that's the thing that maybe I wouldn't know what to look for. I haven't bought a house, but I've lived in a rental, and I think sometimes there are things that haven't even known were things like, okay, this is not a house thing, but like our fridge broke, and I had no idea that you were supposed to keep an eye on the fridge or look after the fridge, clean the fridge regularly, because it's my first time living out of home. So I think it's all good and well to say be vigilant, but you need to know what to look for or what you need to know.
Okay, so I mean, I would say if you have your own house and it has an external area and you've got a garden, one of the things you should be very vigilant about is water, right? So are your drains clear? Are your gutters clear? And are your downpipes connecting to a proper stormwater system? Because you'll find houses out there where the downpipes just let the water out at the ground level, and then it soaks the footing of the house, and that causes structural problems and attracts termites, and so water is a huge one. Like that's a really big one, and that's something that you can kind of fairly easily deal with, because you can see where your downpipes are going. It's not expensive to get a plumber out to blast out your storm drains or anything like that. It's worth doing that kind of thing. Well, your roof obviously again is another important thing. You don't want water coming through the roof. So, you only have to go up there once. Now you don't even have to go up there. You just have to put a ladder up against it and kind of a few different places and check that it's all intact or all the tiles there where they should be, that kind of thing. Those are important outside. And also, I would say, like, around your house, try not to have too much vegetation growing up against the building. It's generally not good practice in my book. It's better to have it back a meter or two, like I don't really. So I would say clear the vegetation around your house, like especially in a hot climate like I live in, because that's the kind of thing that brings termites, and then they get into the timbers of the house. And that's, you talk about not knowing that the fridge is acting up. People can have termites for 5 or 6 years and not know it, and then suddenly the ceiling collapses. So things like that. Yeah. But inside the house, then it's like, I mean, it's mostly inside the house. You'll see the problems because they're in your eye line most of the time. But I would say things like, one of the things that people should probably be generally a bit more vigilant about is ceiling mold or any evidence of mold, either in bathrooms or any other rooms. And again, with like, and I'm talking from somebody who lives in a hot and humid climate, that's a real hazard. Like, not just that it would happen, but if it happened, the kinds of mold that can happen can be genuinely very, very bad for you, especially if you don't know they're there. And you're sleeping in there, and so if you kind of ever see like something that looks a bit sketchy around an air conditioning vent, for example, or the extraction fan in your bathroom, or along a windowsill or anything like that, it's worth having a closer look.
Okay.
And if it looks like it's going to be a problem, getting it dealt with properly and professionally, that would be one that I would always kind of caution people on. But when it comes to things like appliances and stuff like that, they're generally fine till they're not. You know?
Okay, I'm glad to hear that we did the right thing with our fridge then.
Oh yeah, look, I mean, who knows? Fridges don't generally give any warning that they're going to stop. They just tend to stop.
Yes, we've had that twice, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not 100%. Mine is working very well at the moment either, and it's relatively new. So, but one thing you can do actually on that is you can get a fridge thermometer, like, and sit it in there, and then you can check the temperatures of the fridge periodically and see if it's going up or down. Because if it is, then there's a problem.
I mean, that's a fairly simple way to know that there is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, if the fridge was 4 degrees 2 hours ago and it's now 6 degrees or 2 degrees, then and nothing else has changed, because the fridge should stay at a constant temperature inside.
And it's not me keep opening the fridge to see if there's anything to eat, closing the fridge, looking again.
You'd want to leave it open for much longer than that to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so yeah, that's like if you suspect your fridge, or indeed you can do the same thing with an oven. Like sometimes your oven won't be. You'll set it to 200 and it's not producing 200 degrees of heat. Again, there's ways of kind of testing that.
Okay.
If you want to, but yeah, mostly, as I say, appliances just tend to fail when they fail, and that's the other thing is they're mostly not worth repairing. Most modern appliances are not worth repairing. If they're in warranty, that's one thing, but if they're not, or if they were cheap to begin with, just it's not worth repairing.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that I guess we've come to a place where it's not worth repairing things. Good and bad, I guess.
I mean, some of the higher end brands, yeah, they will have repair services and they will, but an awful lot of brands don't. And especially some of the lower end of the market stuff, it's sort of single wear only, single use only. It'll run as long as it runs, and once it goes, it's gone. You spend $300 on a dryer. If you get 3 years out of it, you're doing really well.
So we're going to move on to our audience questions now. And if you, our listeners, want to contribute to our audience questions, we actually are looking for your questions on our social media, Instagram stories. So keep an eye on those. Usually the beginning of the week will let you know who we are interviewing and what topic we're going to be talking about. So send us your questions. We'd love to hear them. And today we have 2 questions from our audience. The first question is, what innovative and sustainable building materials are on the horizon, and how can they contribute to both environmental conservation and long-term durability?
That's an interesting question. The innovative building materials thing is an interesting one because stuff comes and goes, and you hear about this is going to be the next big thing, and then it doesn't happen. Like one of the areas where there's been a lot of innovation is concrete. Because I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the concrete is quite significantly polluting. Like its manufacture has an enormous environmental footprint associated with it. So there's been an effort to try and find a better alternative, something that can be manufactured with less environmental footprint that performs as well, if not better. And I remember a few years ago, all of the talk was about a thing called hempcrete, which is basically a concrete made out of hemp. Which actually, by the way, hemp is probably the best textile we have, and we don't use nearly enough of it. Like hemp is extraordinarily strong and durable and powerful material, and can be grown very easily at scale and should be used a lot more than it is for clothes, ropes, all sorts of things. But because hemp gets associated with cannabis, even though they're not the same plant, they are the same plant, but they're not the same. They're as different as a red rose from a white rose. So fields of hemp are not fields of drugs, and there'd be no reason in the world not to have them. But that was a technology that got replaced that we could still be using more of. It didn't get replaced for any good reason, but I do remember a few years ago, hempcrete was the big one. Like this new innovation in concrete using hemp. Never went anywhere really, unfortunately, as far as I could tell. You get a lot of materials innovation as well in things like insulation products. So, for example, there's rock wool. You can get pink bats. You can get fiberglass. You can get the sort of paper that they spray. Can't remember what it's called right now. You can get hemp insulation. You can get all sorts of different types of insulation. And there's some great innovation in that, and some of them perform way better than others So again, it's sort of, a lot of these decisions come down to, well, what are you kind of designing for? Like, so if you're designing to keep the heat out, then certain types of insulation will work better than others. If you're designing to keep the heat in, then you'll have different choices. But the insulation one is one where there's been a lot of kind of innovation with sustainable materials and things like that. There's a lot of stuff happening as well with kind of things like, I mean, I don't know how sustainable they really are, but like hybrid timber systems, for example, like modwood and things like that. The argument being that like they're mostly made from waste products, so they're sustainable in the sense that otherwise the stuff that would end up in landfill or whatever. Like modwood is a fusion of plastic and timber. It looks like timber, feels like plastic. It's very heavy duty. A lot of it comes from recycled materials. That can be used for decking materials. For example, you could use it for decking boards. You often see it in national parks. You'll see it a lot. Mm-hmm. On the little walkways and things, because it's extremely durable. Extremely durable. So things like that all come into play as well. Like you kind of think, I could maybe I could go timber there on the deck and that'd be pretty sustainable. But then you'll be painting it, you'll be staining it every 2 years and having to sand it back. And whereas you could kind of go for something like modwood and say, well, this is a recycled product. I'll never have to treat it. I'll never have to paint it. It comes pre-colored. So it has a higher structural loading most of the time, so again, there's kind of choices to be made. But I guess as a final bit on this, from my observation, it really falls upon the buyer or whoever's commissioning the building to have done their own research on this stuff. Because if nobody's going to generally suggest it to you, like, the Australian construction industry is extremely rigid in terms of its inflexibility around using different materials or different building techniques or different types of machinery or different design approaches or whatever. Like, they are incredibly reluctant to do anything outside of the norm. More so now than ever, because there's less tradespeople around now than there ever were before relative to the demand. So unless you're like an extremely wealthy individual who's commissioning a one-off house and has effectively a bottomless pit of money to spend on it, and there are people out there like that, plenty of them, but it's not everybody. Unless you're one of them, then you're probably going to be offered and only able to take advantage of the basic stuff. But once you want to get into the fancy, sustainable stuff, as the commissioner of as the person who has initiated the design, you'll be the one that's pushing it, not the other way around generally. You might have a clever architect that suggests it, but your builder won't care. They won't be pointing it out to you in all likelihood, saying you could go this way, could this be more sustainable. They'll just go, just give me the plans, I'll build, the basic, the better, please.
So it's basically up to us, the people who are buying the houses or commissioning the houses, to take charge and to know what we want and to do the research and to, tell people that that's what we want.
100%, yes, yeah. The person who's commissioning the project, the proponent of the project, really has to be in charge of the project, and as the person who's writing the checks, they have that entitlement.
Yeah.
But yes, you do have to, you do have to insert yourself in a very forward position, let's say, and a lot of people don't or wouldn't be equipped or wouldn't be knowledgeable enough to. And the other thing to remember as well is that, and we've kind of touched on this as well, is there's the sustainability of the materials that go into building, the house or whatever, and sort of what that says about the embodied carbon of the building or the total sustainability, of the building. But sustainability goes beyond that, because sustainability is also very focused on the operation of the building. Like, for example, so sustainability would be trying to keep your electricity use down. So again, if you can design with materials that stop your house from overheating or keep it warm in the winter, depending on where you live, you'll use less air conditioning, less heating. Therefore, that is sustainable in and of itself. Likewise, if you have to turn on the air conditioning, but the air conditioning is running off a bank of solar panels on the roof, then that's a little better than, there's a lot to it. It all, you can look at it from a variety of different perspectives, but it's the construction phase plus the operational phase, and the operational phase is way bigger than the construction phase, because that's all the time you'll be living there.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the design phase is focused on the operations phase in some ways.
Well, I guess that's what I'm probably trying to say in an awkward sort of way, is that like you should be designing for a comfortable operation.
Okay. Not just, I guess, making sure that you have the best building materials.
Yeah. Oh, look, we built this wonderful building from bamboo and hempcrete,
But it's not insulated.
It's not insulated and it's awfully warm in the summer and desperately cold in the winter.
Yeah. Okay.
Not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I guess, kind of related, our second question. In the face of climate change, how can buildings be designed to withstand extreme weather events and contribute to community resilience?
That's a very good question. The first thing that has to be accounted for is what are the climate change impacts that you're dealing with? And they will be very different place to place, city to city. And funny, actually, I gave a lecture about this yesterday, funny enough, but I was saying, if you're up in far north Queensland, you're dealing with cyclones. If you're in southeast Queensland or northern New South Wales, it's floods. If you're down here in Melbourne, it's probably heat waves, or maybe things like thunderstorms. And again, storms are a big thing in the subtropics as well. And so places will have different climate change impacts based on their existing regional climate regime, based on their latitude, their longitude, all of that, right? So the climate change impacts in a place like Melbourne, even though it's only an hour and a half by plane from Brisbane, will be totally different. So first thing is have a very clear understanding of what the climate change impacts you're facing actually are. Like there's no point in preparing for flooding if that's never going to be a risk. There's no point, or there's no point in having a bushfire management plan in the center of a city where there won't be a bushfire, So know what you're dealing with, and they're not constant and it shifts around. So that's a big one. And once you know what the key impacts are, then you can start designing to respond to them in a way. You can start designing your buildings to respond to them in a way. So for example, if you're prone to flooding, it would not be sensible to locate all of your key infrastructure in the basement, which is often where it goes, but it would not be particularly wise in the case of a city where there's so for example, things like computer servers or, anything like that should probably be put halfway up the building rather than in the basement, because, it's one thing for them to lose power. It's a whole other thing for them to be underwater. So, again, like you see, the bushfire thing, particularly at the behest of the insurance companies, I would say, but with the bushfire thing, there's an awful lot of kind of bushfire proof houses coming on the market now, mostly steel framed and steel framed with color bond roofs. So there's not a lot that can actually go on fire. But that's a response again to another form of impact, fire risk. So it depends on what your impacts are and responding to them. And then in terms of also how can buildings function better in this regard, or be one of the things that we're really looking at right now is this idea of kind of refuge spaces. So like in the event, say, of a heat wave, like a very severe heat wave, and the power goes down or starts to go down or whatever the case may be, or people just cannot cool their apartments anymore. Do we have buildings around the city where we can gather large groups of people, keep them safe for a couple of hours till things normalize with the weather? These kind of cool spaces, for example. What usually happens is people informally run to a public library or a cinema or a shopping center. But cities are getting much more clever about activating these spaces and having a set of them pre-planned so that in the event of X, then we can tell people to go to these places. So that's a big one, especially around heat at the moment. We're really looking at like what buildings would be suitable, like what would be the criteria of a cool refuge? How many buildings do we have that would meet that criteria? And also what mechanisms would be needed or could be needed to persuade the owners of those buildings to open them up, given that they'll be the ones paying for the air conditioning and taking on the liability. And so there's this potentially a role there for government to step in and say, look, you'll be compensated for the cost and the liability will shift to us. It won't come out of your public liability insurance if somebody trips in here, So there needs to be governance structures, but yeah. So buildings can be designed to withstand climate change impacts on them, and they can also be designed to help communities in the event of climate change impacts.
I really love that because I was actually discussing something like this with my friends the other day. We've recently moved into an apartment with air conditioning, which is just amazing. But they were saying that their air conditioning broke. And I said to them, well, if it's a really hot day, you live close by, actually come into our apartment, because then we're going to be running the aircon anyway because it's going to be hot. You may as well come into our apartment and be there. And that's, like, as you said, a rather informal way of doing it. I don't mind if people come into my space for half a day or a day so that they don't have to be in the heat. And it doesn't matter who they are. So yeah, I love this idea of having apartment buildings or having spaces where people can come and use the heat, where it's not necessarily like a shopping center where you have to go and pay for something.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I see exactly what you're saying. The idea is that what we really are striving towards is a system where you can go to a shopping center and not have to pay for something, because it's recognized that there's a genuine sort of health emergency right now, and certain people who have particular vulnerabilities, elderly people, for example, just need to be somewhere cool.
And also having, I guess, the infrastructure for people to go to these spaces.
Yeah, good point. How do we get them there? Yeah, like whether they're community buses or whatever the case may be. And if so, they need to be air conditioned as well.
And then, I mean, this is me just thinking of everything now. Like, you know, if they're going to be there all day, they need something to eat.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
but this is all part of it. I mean, if people go into an evacuation center or go into, you know, a cyclone shelter center or something like that, then all of those things will have been thought about. And we're used to thinking about it for those kinds of things. We're not really used to thinking about it right now for things like, at least not yet, for things like floods and fires. Yes, bushfires, cyclones, that kind of like rapid event, yeah. But the more slow onset stuff, we need to just get a bit better at sort of coming up with conventions and systems for this, including compensation for the people whose buildings we're using.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your answers to our listeners. Very interesting topics, things that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. If our listeners want to find out more about you, if they want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Couple of places. I'm probably easiest to find professionally on LinkedIn. Dr. Tony Matthews. I keep my page pretty active and up to date, so I'm easy to find there. I also have a Substack that I'm running. It's called Sights on Cities. Sights is in SIGHTS, Sights on Cities, where I publish a lot of my essays and writing at the moment. I mean, if you are interested in reading like the large volume of my writing, go to theconversation.com.au. It's historically I've published there, at least my public writing, but I'm increasingly self-publishing these days on Substack, so check out Sights on Cities as well. So LinkedIn or Sights on Cities, they're the two main ones. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We'll make sure that those links are in our show notes so people can find all of your work, hopefully. Always happy to share my work, so yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much, and thank you for our conversation. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.